Welcome to Fleet Street, the traditional home of the British media. In 1702, London's first daily newspaper, the Daily Courant, was published near here. And for almost 300 years, this busy area was the centre of the UK's newspaper industry. By the 20th century, most of the country's major media organisations had their headquarters here. This building was the home of the Daily Telegraph. This was the Daily Express. And this was the head office of the international press agency Reuters. The Sun, the News of the World, and the Times were all nearby. But there are very few newspaper organisations around here now. After all, these old ornate buildings aren't very suitable for the rapidly changing industry. For centuries, most people in the UK got their news from newspapers. At the industry's height, popular tabloid newspapers like The Sun and the Daily Mirror had a circulation of around 4 million. Today, The Sun's circulation is less than 2 million, while the Daily Mirror's is less than 1 million. Why? Because many people don't read newspapers. They get their news online instead. Millions of people across the world read news websites, and they have huge global circulations. Yahoo News, the world's most read news website, has an incredible 175 million readers a month. And now social media sites are changing everything. Sites like Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn don't produce news, but people often read and share news stories on their sites. In the USA, for example, 64% of adults use Facebook, and 30% of these people reported that they read most of their news on the site. So people aren't reading the front pages anymore. They're reading the most popular stories on their social media accounts. But there are problems. Many social media users aren't journalists, and some of these stories aren't news at all. But social media is so popular that newspapers report on what they say. It's a vicious circle where newspapers report stories, these stories are shared and exaggerated online, and then other newspapers report from social media. Look at this headline, for example. Ghost ship carrying cannibal rats heading for Britain. Sounds terrifying. But the story was hugely overstated. The ship never came near British soil, and there was no proof of rats being on board, certainly not cannibal rats. So, where did this story come from? On the 21st of October 2013, the Irish Independent reported that an old Yugoslavian ship called the Lyubov Orlova had become loose and had gotten lost in the Atlantic Ocean. In the story, the Irish Coast Guard director told the newspaper that the boat had been beside the harbour, so he assumed there were rats on board. A few months later, The Sun picked up the story. They interviewed a Belgian salvage dealer who wanted to find the ship to make money. He claimed there would be lots of rats, and that rats ate each other. Rats became cannibal rats, and the story was soon all over the internet. The ship even got a Facebook page and Twitter account. Many major newspapers reported this cannibal rat story, but in the end had to admit that very little happened. We'll never know if any rats were on board, but if there were, they probably weren't cannibal rats. In one story, an animal expert pointed out that rats are as likely to eat one another as humans are. The empty ship drifted around the ocean before disappearing, probably sinking somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. So, the story wasn't exactly news, but we did learn one thing. We shouldn't believe everything we read in the papers or on the internet.